Now, don't worry, I don't need to run out and get to the studio on time for the radio show at 11 o'clock because it's recorded. So it's on every Saturday at 11 till 12. And it also becomes a podcast. So if you want to see, if you want to hear the episodes, just go online to OC Catholic. That's it, OC Catholic. And then it will give you the radio option, which you punch, and then it will give you the podcasts that the diocese sponsors. Up? Is that right? Great, thanks. So, anyway, it's very wonderful to be with you today, and I'd like to just begin by giving you an opportunity to check in with each other. And some of you already chatting, but I'd just like you to turn to the person in front of you, behind you, next to you or something. Just say what your name is. And then maybe just how you're doing today. Oh, I'm really tired, or, I don't know why I came to this thing. No. Anyway, and then the other question is, how is Lent going so far? Oh, dear. That you might want to share. So let me give you a few minutes just to do that, just to check in. You want to have a seat? Good morning.
Good morning.
Do you want to have a seat? Are you? Yeah. You.
I'm just standing before the.
Oh, okay. I just wanted you to know that there's seats if you want.
Yeah.
Cool. Okay. Good morning. Okay. Everybody had a chance to check in? Okay. First of all, can everyone hear me okay? Okay, because I don't have a mic or anything, so. So thanks for checking in with each other. Does anyone want to report in how Lent's going? Any reports?
I guess I'm a taxpayer or a tax collector.
You're a tax collector. There you go. Okay. That was from Mass today. Okay. Anybody else? How Lent's going?
I'm the second tax collector.
You're the second oh my God, we got a lot of them today. We're all tax collectors. Okay. Anybody else?
I've been eating ice cream that I said I wasn't going to eat.
Now, I didn't say this is confession. I mean, okay.
We said we're doing reasonably well with one, but we will fall down and have to pick ourselves up and start over again.
Reasonably well, but fall and pick up. As long as you pick up and start again, that's good. Don't just stay down. That's the deal. So I remember when I was the pastor of St. Joseph Church in Santa Ana, what I always do with any staff that I'm kind of responsible for, I'd always have a check-in thing, kind of like we just did, and how you doing today, that sort of thing. And I asked that question one staff meeting, and the person said, "Well, you know, it hasn't been going very good at all." And then she said, "Oh well, maybe next year." I always love that response. "Oh well, maybe next year." So, don't say "oh well, maybe next year," because we still have a few weeks to go in Lent. So, and you know, I love this image, and if you were here when I led the Morning of Reflection in Advent, it was not this past Advent, but it was the one the year before. There's an image I like to use for a day like today, or a morning like this morning. And it's based on a Protestant minister whose name is Howard Thurman. And he said, he lived in the 50s, he said, before you get into bed at night or out of bed in the morning, simmer. And I love that image because I like to eat, for one thing, but I also, I like to cook, and sometimes a recipe requires simmering. And you know, simmering means that it tells you to put in the water, liquid, whatever it is, and then put in your ingredients, and then bring it to a boil. And when it comes to a boil, turn it down and let it simmer. But what you have to do for something to simmer is turn down the heat. And it's that allows all the beautiful flavors to come together. So that's what a morning like today is about. It's about turning down the heat of our lives and just letting ourselves listen to see what the Lord might have to say to us during this time together. I've been suffering a lot from allergies this last week. I'm better today than I have been. So my voice is a little weird, but anyway. And also, I always think it's a good idea regularly to simmer in the sense that Howard was talking about. In other words, to just take a moment every day, you know, to kind of just stop and just, you know, say, what just happened? You know, because we just move from one thing to the next and maybe don't think about it or ask about it. And it's good to stop and ask what just happened, to simmer and to let the Lord be with us. So that's what today is about. And I mentioned at Mass today, and you saw in the advertising, that I'm calling this a few hours together. The theme is Life Wins. And I'll say more about that later. And I have three parts to my morning here with you. One is going to the garden, meaning the Garden of Gethsemane. Another one is carrying the cross. And then the whole idea of life winning, and that has to do with the promise of eternal life. So I also I have a handout for you, and those are notes, summaries of each of the presentations. So you can take that home with you. And also you'll see on the handout there are 2 reflection questions on each one. Maybe we might ask ourselves a couple of them today, and then I would like to invite you to use it during these remaining weeks of Lent if you find it helpful. So it's a little tool. And then there's more coming up, but that's enough for now. So, with that in mind, let us pray. Loving and gracious God, we thank you for gathering us together today. We thank you for this time to simmer, to turn down the heat, to let us be open to what you might have to say to us through each other, through these reflections, through prayer, and especially how we might allow ourselves to continue to grow spiritually during these days of Lent. We know that you are present with us now. We place before you all that is going on in the world today. Some things very hard and difficult and tragic, and others that are wonderful and good and hopeful, and all of it we place in your hands, Lord. And as we gather in the name of your Father, let us say, Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Amen. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. And just to mention the time frame again, we will be done by 11:30. That's what they told me the time frame was. So just wanted to make sure that's good with everybody, right? Yeah. Okay. All right. So, going to the garden. You know, as we watch the images of the war that's going on again in the world, in the Middle East, and the bombs going off, and the smoke, and the noise, and those things following at the same time, but we don't have it much because of what's going on in the Middle East, but the same kind of things happening still in Ukraine. And we saw the terrible destruction that happened in Gaza. And in other parts of the world were so much destructive violence going on, and so much agony. The agony of people in these stories, I think, at least it does for me, the agony kind of seeps into me, you know, as I see what's going on out there, you know. And in some ways, the agony of the world becomes our agony, even though we're not experiencing it firsthand. This agony touches us at other times personally, too. That we have our personal agonies. And we have times throughout our lives where things have been sometimes difficult things going on. And then the personal histories that we might have regarding human beings hurting other human beings, and what happens when human beings commit atrocities against others. And I'm thinking today that we have our times in our lives sometimes when we feel helpless, we feel desperate. Sometimes we feel rudderless, like, where am I going? You know, just kind of like that little boat out there on the lake that's going in circles and not getting anywhere. And it is agonizing. Life's disasters can be devastating. And so today, as I bring that up, whether they are personal or global, when bad things happen and when bad things happen, discouragement in the face of it can lead to that sense kind of defeat, you know, like, what's going on? Where's this all going? Now, one of the most dramatic examples of this in Scripture is Job. Remember the story of Job? Oh, the poor guy. Man. He was a very prosperous person. He had a huge family. He had a big estate. He had lots of livestock. And then suddenly, as you know in the story, the livestock was stolen. The children, they were all swept away by a terrible storm. And then he got this awful skin disease. I mean, one disaster after the next happened to Job. And he says at one point something that maybe we have said at times, or if we hadn't said it, maybe we felt it. And that's this famous line he says, "I shall never see happiness again." I shall never see happiness again. Well, I felt that way sometimes before when certain things go on. Job is not alone in his feelings like that. And then I fast forward to Jesus, and the scripture says in Matthew, "Then Jesus came with them to a place called Gethsemane. And he said to his disciples, 'Sit here while I go over there and pray.'" And when Jesus went to the garden, he took along Peter, and he took two of the sons, James and John, the sons of Zebedee. And he began to feel sorrow, and he began to feel distress. And he even said to those guys, he says, "My soul is sorrowful. My soul is sorrowful, even to death." Pretty powerful words. And that night, Jesus was very keenly aware of the ravages that are caused by human sinfulness. That's what he was agonizing about. He was painfully and intensely conscious of human suffering that night in Gethsemane. And he was also profoundly aware that his heavenly Father was calling him to take on the sins of humanity. I can't even imagine what that would have felt like. To take on the sins of humanity. And of course, as we know, taking on the sins of our humanity would result in his own suffering and his own gruesome death on the cross. Of course, he went to pray. He went to the garden to pray. And that night he was hoping to have some company, but his sleepy friends left him alone in his agony. You know the famous line, "Couldn't you just stay up an hour with me, guys?" And then not only did he hope to have some company as he prayed in his agony, he also had another hope, and it's probably a hope that most, if not all of us, have had sometime, and that is, I hope I don't have to go through this. Yeah, I don't want to go through this. Who of us have not wanted not to have to go through some terrible suffering? Lord, I don't want to do this. Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me. Lord, in our own lives, how many times, when have we ever said, Lord, please let this pass. Please let this pass. And Jesus kept on praying, and with that prayer, he eventually handed his life over to his Father. He surrendered. He says, "My Father, if it is not possible that this cup pass without me drinking it, your will be done. Your will be done." Your will be done. In his agony, Jesus trusted something very profound. He trusted that there would be more than the suffering. And he was right. His willingness to take on the sins of the world led to his victory over the death of sin and physical death itself. And that victory over death and sin that happened through his resurrection would not have happened unless he said yes to taking on the sins of the world in the first place. So I guess my point here for us to keep in mind is that the suffering was not the whole story. You know, as I reflect on the kinds of things I just was reflecting, I'm thinking, oh my God, they're probably thinking, oh, this is so depressing. Please, talk about something else. Well, it's upsetting, yes. What things that are hard are upsetting, and it's at least March 14th, 2026, because that agonizing night of Jesus Christ did not get the best of him. And so we're still telling the story. In fact, in its own strange way, his agonizing night brought out the best in him. His agony that night led to the declaration of his unconditional love of humanity. And that was the best thing that could have happened. That he put out there, okay, your will be done. And then we know later on in the story about that we have what we call the Last Supper, and Jesus gave the bread and wine, and we won't go into that part, but it was all a declaration of his unconditional love that would find its fruition on the cross. That love that is so strong that, as we know, he gave his own life for us. So, that agony in the garden that night led to what our lives as his disciples declare. And what our lives declare as Catholics is that our suffering and the suffering of the world are not the whole story. They're part of the story, and they're not the whole story. In the midst of his own feelings of sorrow and distress, Jesus went to the garden that night to pray. He went to the garden that night to pray. Why did he do that? He did that because he trusted that his Father would be with him to see him through whatever it was that he had to endure. That's why he went to the garden. And you know, he could have just avoided the whole agonizing scene. He could have just run from his sorrowful soul. He could have said, I'm out of here. That soul that he says, I'm sorrowing even unto death. He could have run away, but he didn't. In fact, he did the opposite of running. He fell. He fell to the ground in prayer. And as we know from the scripture, he literally sweated blood. Pretty profound. Why? Because he didn't run. Instead, he fell to the ground. And he was reassured of his Father's presence. My Father, your will be done. Today, in the midst of our own sorrow and in the midst of our own distress, and in the midst of the world's suffering and pain, I would like to suggest that Jesus invites us to go to the garden. He invites us to go to the garden. His agony in the garden invites us, in our times of discouragement and stress, to go to the garden to be renewed in our conviction of faith. And the conviction of our faith is that the mission of Jesus was to preach the good news that the suffering we experience in our life is not the whole picture. The good news is that the redeeming love of Jesus is with us in the midst of life's suffering. And I use that word redeeming because I think that whole idea of redemption is not very strong these days. I think these days we pretty much leave stuff to the bad. And we do. I mean, it's everywhere. There's not really a sense of redemption. And that's why I chose this theme, because I think that as Catholics, we need to be agents of proclamation of redemption. That we can, with God's grace, bring something out of this to a different place that is a good place. And the perspective of faith is that God's love is always with us, even though a current circumstance may suggest otherwise. And that's how am I supposed to believe that God's love is with us when people are blowing each other up in the world every hour? How can I believe in God's love with us? That's the perspective of faith, that God's love is with us, even though a current circumstance may suggest otherwise. The challenge for us, and it's a challenge for me, is to keep that in mind when there is nothing glorious about what we may be experiencing at the moment, and where there is nothing glorious about what might be going on in the world. Because we believe in redemption. We believe that God's grace is stronger than evil. We believe in redemption. Now, somebody to look to as proof before Jesus is Job. It turns out that he was wrong about never seeing happiness again. Eventually, he did find the comforting presence of God. And we know that Job eventually found God again. And even in that horrible suffering, his declaration, "I shall never find happiness again." Guess what he did? Job teaches us, and this is, I think, a really important lesson. Job teaches us that it is not helpful to accept any feeling as final. And that is something that can happen a lot, especially when we're feeling badly or when we're suffering, that we think it's always going to be that way. And here's the good news about feelings. They're kind of like the weather. They're changeable. Who doesn't know that about the weather? I mean, in these summer days of the end of winter. You know? Well, that's kind of like feelings, you know? It's 35, 47 degrees at night, and it's 85, 95 in the day. That's feelings. They're changeable. So, like Jesus did when he was in the Garden of Gethsemane, when we feel overwhelmed by life's circumstances, we need to allow ourselves to get perspective. We need to allow ourselves to get perspective. What does that mean? Well, in my life, I've come to see that when I go to the garden, you know, when I just stop for a minute and ask God to be with me in whatever it is, then I get smart enough to wait the discouraging feelings out because we know they're temporary. Now, that is not always easy to do, but it is something that's really important to do. Wait it out. It's temporary. One of the things also that I do sometimes, and I think it's a useful perspective, is to argue with those feelings of despair, to argue with them, to argue with that hopelessness, confident that with God's grace they will not defeat us. You're not going to get me, hopelessness. You're not going to get me. Yeah, I'm discouraged now, but you're not going to get me. I'm argue, literally, you know. It's important to do, and the motivation to argue is because it's worth it, because God's grace is worth it. That will get us through it. Now, sometimes the advice that I'm giving to wait out the discouraging feelings, we can't do it by ourselves. Sometimes we need help to do that. And so that's why the perspective of the garden might mean that it's time to seek professional help. Sometimes the professional help of a therapist is what we need to help us get through those feelings of desperation and despair and depression. We can't do it by ourselves. Sometimes what we need is the wisdom of a spiritual director, and to go to the spiritual director or choose somebody to be one. That's the perspective of the garden. But if I never go to the garden, I wouldn't think of these things. I'd just be kind of wallowing in misery of the discouragement and all, without the perspective of, maybe I need some help with this, you know? Maybe I need to see a spiritual director. Sometimes the perspective is to seek out the reassurance of a good friend. I mean, there's nothing like the reassurance of a good friend in certain circumstances, but sometimes we resist doing that because we resist asking for help. Now, I'm going to say this, and if once I say this to you, you probably will never want to go to confession to me. So here it is. Here goes. Sometimes depending on what the confession is, sometimes this is a penance I give. I said, your penance is for you to go to your best friend and say, please help me. Or go to somebody you trust and say, please help me. Sometimes that's a super hard thing to do. Because remember this morning I talked about that arrogance thing? You know? How could Father Christopher need help? My goodness, you know? Or whoever we are, okay? But please help me are 3 words that are sometimes tough to say, but sometimes really important to say. Maybe the perspective of the garden, in terms of tough times or difficulties, could lead us to some kind of support group. You know, the good thing these days is there's support groups for almost everything. If you have a cancer diagnosis, and even a specific cancer, or if you know, a woman has had a miscarriage, or there's all kinds of support groups out there. But as we know, the hardest step is the first one, and that's to find it, and then the next one is to go to it. But that's the perspective of the garden. Because a support group can give us an additional needed perspective to help us through whatever it is, because we're with people who are going through or have gone through the same thing. And so that can be very helpful. Sometimes the perspective of the garden might be to keep us motivated to do spiritual reading. You know, spiritual reading is a great thing. And the trick, though, is to find something that you find useful and worthwhile. And again, if you don't know, ask somebody that you trust, you know, who you respect as a good spiritual author. You're doing something right this very second to help you get perspective. I hope it will. And that's being at this little retreat together. And take advantage of talks and other opportunities that are there to help us grow and get the tools that we need. We need tools to live our lives of faith in this complicated and troubled world. We can't do it without the tools. We need them. And I would like to suggest that maybe, at least for me, a perspective of going to the garden is maybe to think about forming a little group with whoever, just a little group to pray for peace in the world. And that's all that you commit yourself, you know, once a week or twice a week with 3 or 4 people, even if it's on the phone. Or whatever, but that you gather with a couple people just to pray for peace. And then follow that up with seeing where do each of us in our own life need to be peacemakers. Where is there conflict? Where is there division? Where is there some kind of rupture or something like that in my life? And if I'm going to pray for world peace, I better think about the personal piece of interpersonal relationships with family and friends and all that. But I think it'd be very cool if our parishes at this time could be known as places. You know, the parishioners of St. Polycarp Church, they're forming little peace prayer groups during these days. Not complicated, just calling up a few people. Maybe a perspective of the garden when we're feeling in that agony or whatever is to move outward and to help somebody else. Archbishop Fulton Sheen. You know, Archbishop Fulton Sheen was they say, the first televangelist. It wasn't the Protestants. It was the Catholics. And he was, you know, first television show. Guess what his show was called? I mean, you probably know what it was called. What? His TV show. Life is worth living. Remember the theme of today, life wins. You know? Life is worth living. A very, very, very popular. In fact, Robert Schuller, who started the Crystal Cathedral, and who was one of the original televangelists as well, in the Protestant circles, Robert Schuller called Archbishop Sheen his mentor. He knew him personally. He had him, in fact, Bishop Fryer just gave me a little video of Archbishop Sheen preaching at the it's the campus there, and he did it twice. It was in the Arboretum, that building, because the Crystal Cathedral hadn't been built yet. But Fulton Sheen preached there 2 times. And Robert Schuller said to me, I know it because he said it right to me, he said, Archbishop Sheen was my mentor. And that's why if you go to the Christ Cathedral, I don't know if you've ever been to the St. Callistus Chapel. Well, it's the chapel that's on the lower level, beautiful chapel. We have a devotional chapel. One of them is it's called the Legacy Chapel, and it's kind of a history of getting to the cathedral. Well, in that Legacy Chapel, we have a painting of Dr. Schuller and his wife Arvella, and right there with them is Archbishop Sheen. We put Fulton Sheen in there as well to kind of honor that relationship. But anyway, I don't want to talk about him. Let me tell you what he said. Okay. Anyway, perspective of the garden. Close your mouth. No. Anyway, Fulton Sheen once wrote, he said, "The very joy of alleviating the sorrow of another is the lessening of one's own." The very joy of alleviating the sorrow of another is lessening of one's own. And then he put it this way. He says, if we dig someone else out of a hole, we get out of the hole we're in. Very wise. If we dig somebody else out of the hole, we get out of the hole we're in. So, on his most agonizing night, Jesus headed to Gethsemane. And I like to call it a garden of prayer, as we've talked about. A garden of refreshed conviction. And that refreshed conviction is the conviction that death and sin don't win. That sin is forgiven, physical life is not defeated by death because of the resurrection of Jesus. In other words, redemption is possible. And also, the garden can be a place of renewed perspective. Those different examples that I gave you. And so, I just like to conclude this little section by saying that sometimes a trip to the garden is just what we need. So, I have the handout now for you. Maybe you could help me distribute these. The green one.
Okay.
It's called Going to the Garden. And again, the handout is a kind of a summary of my reflection. And so the reflection questions there are, again, I give you these questions, some of them for reflecting during these coming weeks of Lent. What is a particularly difficult challenge I am facing in my life at this time? And what does going to the garden mean for me? What does that mean for me? So I'd like to see if anybody has any questions or comments or clarifications, insights, something that might have spoken to you, something that raised a question. How is it for you to think about going to the garden? Just a little opportunity to raise anything. Yes?
I know I was having this thought while you were talking, was relates to the concept that, through Christ, we have sort of what I consider the foreknowledge of the resurrection. Did he have that at any time during this stage?
Forethought of the resurrection?
Or no?
Foreknowledge of it?
Resurrection.
Jesus? Yes,
He did.
he did. And declaration of that we just had in the scripture on the second Sunday of Lent, his transfiguration. When Jesus went up the mountain with his Peter, James, and John, and when he was transfigured, when his face became dazzling, his clothes white and glorious and all that, what he was doing was giving them a vision of his glorified self after his resurrection. Well, no, it happened before his resurrection, but he wanted to give them a taste of it. And it's a great story because, as you recall, it was so lovely what was happening, they never wanted it to end. They wanted it to go on forever. And so, let us erect 3 booths or tents. It's good for us to be here. So we just want to hang out here with you like this for the rest of our lives. And of course, Jesus, he didn't say it exactly. Well, maybe he did, but it's not written this way. No, guys, we got to go back down the mountain. We got to go through some stuff first. But he gave them that vision of his resurrection to carry with them when they had to face suffering and challenge in their lives. And the way I do put it is that he gave the disciples a little taste of heaven when they were on the mountain. And I call a taste of heaven those times when we, those moments in life that are just wonderful. We feel good, we feel happy, we feel loved, whatever it might be. Like those moments, they're for most of us, they're kind of not, they're not every day for sure. But it's that kind of, I don't ever want this to end, And so what we take with us not is the vision of the resurrection that we firsthand experienced, the vision of glory that Jesus did. We carry within us our faith in the resurrection to help us face the challenges and the difficulties of life. So that's a great question, though. So yeah, he did have a foreknowledge. He trusted it would happen. He trusted it. And then there's other times when he talked about the temple being destroyed and 3 days it will be raised up and those kinds of things like that. But one thing, and I don't think I'll get into it much here, but I'll just say it, is that it's kind of interesting to think about the fact that when the disciples of Jesus were living, they had not experienced the resurrection when he was saying stuff to him before he actually rose. So they heard things differently than we do.
Yeah.
Because we hear through the ears and eyes of belief in the resurrection. When he actually did rise and they discovered the empty tomb, then they had that's what he's talking about. We do believe. But there was a point that they went through where, like this one, the agony in the garden, where he hadn't risen yet, and they did not have that to carry with them, except those 3 guys had that vision, the vision of the transfiguration.
That's the significance of the resurrection. The idea that without the resurrection, the cross is meaningless.
That's right, absolutely. There's no, it's meaningless. It's folly, as they say. Yeah. Yeah, the whole thing hinges on the resurrected Lord. Yeah. Good question. Anybody else? Any questions or comments? Okay. Well, before we go to the next reflection, do you want to stand up and have a little break, and then get something to eat, or oh, thank you, I appreciate that. Yeah. Any garden thoughts?
I like your notes.
You like the notes?
Yeah.
Yeah, I like PowerPoints to a point. But I like the idea that there's summaries of things and all that. But I don't like it because if you're the speaker, everybody's looking at the PowerPoint. And it's really hard. So, because part of speaking is connecting with people by eye. And so, I do use PowerPoint. In fact, I didn't know that it was available. I told that to Deacon Larry. He said yesterday, it was a little too late, if you need a projector and stuff. But because I do use it, but not exactly that way. So what I do instead is I make summaries of my talks. And then you have it, you can take it with you, you can read it later, and yeah.
If you try to take notes and you miss stuff.
Well, that's the other thing, yeah.
Once I've walked out the door.
Yeah. So, you forget once you walk out the door?
Not that bad.
Hey, you know what? It's been really nice. We'll see you all. It's been great. So.
Sorry.
Well, at least you said it.
Honesty.
Okay, you know what I learned when I was taking a preaching class, homiletics it's called. I remember somebody, one of our professors said, we did a really good job if somebody can remember your homily until Wednesday. I thought that was true. And I remember one time, I don't know where, I was at Subway sandwiches or something like that. And I remember I was waiting for my sandwich, and this guy was in line, hey, Father! And then he said, are you doing the opposite? I said, and then I remembered that my homily the Sunday before was about the temptation of Jesus, which we have the first Sunday of Lent. And I was talking about how a temptation that we have is the temptation that we have is to not want to be tempted, you know. But forget it, because we're always going to be tempted, you know. So to try to fight having a temptation, waste of energy, okay? But what put the energy into not giving into the temptation? And then my homily was about, if you are tempted, do the opposite. So like Jesus in the tempted to turn the stone into bread after 40 days of not eating. I wouldn't have done too good with that one. I can't go 40 minutes. But anyway, so what did he do? He didn't do it. He did the opposite. He didn't eat anything. Not on bread alone does one live. And so, you know, if you think about it, if you're going to say something mean just about somebody, go to the person and say something really nice. And there's all kinds of examples of you're tempted to do something, and if you think about it and you do the opposite, then you're going to not give into the temptation. All right, fine. I don't need to give the homily. But the guy said to me, I said, he said, yeah, I love that, doing the opposite. And I looked at my calendar. It was Wednesday. So I made it, you know? So anyway, we don't usually know how long. Usually it's longer than walking out the door, though. No, and I know what you mean. That's fine. Yes. Anyway, you have the notes. So, okay. So this one part of the presentation is called Carrying the Cross. And here's the scripture. As they led him away, they laid hold of one Simon the Cyrenian who was coming in from the fields. They put a crossbeam on Simon's shoulder for him to carry along behind Jesus. That's from Luke. I remember when I was a little kid, I went to Holy Family School in Orange. We used to have Stations of the Cross every Friday. And we had these little books, which I loved, because the books had these pictures, but the pictures looked like photographs. They weren't, but they were black and white drawings, I guess. But I remember when I was a kid, I didn't know they had cameras then. But anyway, but I always remember the one of Simon helping Jesus with the cross. And I remember as a little boy, oh man, I would have loved to have been Simon to help Jesus carry the cross. Until someone showed me how big that cross was and how heavy it was. My aspirations to be Simon kind of... But anyway, as a little kid, I really wanted to be Simon, to help Jesus. Jesus carries his cross to the skull place, the place of his crucifixion, John's Gospel. And then he says, on the way, Simon is pressed into service to also carry the cross. So here's the progression. The cross, first carried by Jesus, then carried by Simon, and then carried by Jesus again. The cross was eventually to be carried by all who would believe in him, and that's us. So I guess if you want to put a mind picture in your head, you can picture yourself on that road to Calvary, along with Simon and everybody else, even though it's 2026. But I guess in a weird way, I get to be Simon after all, and so do you. Because we get to, and as difficult as it is, to also carry the cross. All who believe in him. As Mark's gospel says, whoever wishes to come after me must deny himself, take up the cross, and follow me. From Jesus to Simon to us. From Jesus to Simon to us, carrying the cross. When we hear the words of Jesus that we are to take up the cross, I think we think of it mostly as something personal, what I call the personal crosses. The personal affliction of an illness, or some kind of personal problem, or the personal challenge of dealing with difficult people, of a hard situation in the family, dealing with some kind of difficulty in the neighborhood, at work, or in the church. We think of crosses as a traumatic event, something that happens that's really awful, like a car accident, or maybe losing our job, or maybe the sudden death of somebody that we love. I'll never forget when I first started at Christ Cathedral in 2012, and it was 2013, and it was right before the 9:30 Mass that I had, and my phone kept ringing, and it was my niece, and I said, I can't talk to my niece now, we got 10 minutes before Mass or whatever. But then the phone just kept ringing, it kept being her. I thought, I better answer it, and it was her, and she just was crying, and she just told me that my older brother, he was only at the time 63, 64, that he was found dead in his sleep. And I always remember that moment because it was kind of traumatic. It was the first sibling that I had lost. And it was also right before celebrating Mass, and I had to do that. But I also knew I couldn't, if I tried to tell the people what I was carrying in my heart, the news I just got, I would lose it. So I didn't tell them. However, for me, it's, and we probably have our different examples of the big kind of crosses that we've had in our lives, that sort of thing. The personal cross. Just a little side reflection, a side little thing about life and time and stuff and geography. Okay, so the geography. Well, let's talk about the geography of the sacristy at the Arboretum that day when I was in there. The geography, there's cabinets there, and there's, okay, fine. And so I pick up that phone call with that news, And all of a sudden, the geography is exactly the same, but my life is completely different. And that's what happens. Geography is the same, but I'm not the same person anymore because of that phone call. And that's what happens in life, you know? And that's why it's so hard sometimes, because everything externally looks exactly the same. When I went to say Mass that day, celebrate Mass, the people, there they are, they're smiling, they're singing, and the music, and da-da-da-da. And I'm, oh my God, inside, you know? Geography is the same, the person's different. And I just think it's a helpful thing to note as a phenomena of life. The personal crosses. To the extent that these kinds of life events are challenges, yes, they can be described as crosses. The cross that Jesus is talking about in the gospel, when he says that the disciple of Jesus must take up the cross, is yes, it is about facing personal challenges with the confidence that his grace is with us. Yes. However, this is not the whole picture. And this is what I want to emphasize for a minute. Because taking up the cross is not only about going through personal times of suffering and difficulty. It's also about doing what is right. Doing what is right has to do with taking up the cross. Doing what is right for ourselves. Doing what is right, not just for ourselves, but also for the well-being of others. That's also taking up a cross. So I have another category of crosses. The ones that I just described are called personal crosses. Then there's other crosses that I call social crosses. And that's what completes the picture. The right thing for Jesus to do was to do what his Father wanted him to do. And what did his Father want him to do? His Father wanted him to give his life out of love for us. That was the right thing for him to do. Taking up the cross for us is about these kinds of things. It's about such things as promoting the dignity of the human person and protecting the sanctity of human life. It is not an easy thing to be out there in the society of 2026 and say that life is life from the first moment of conception until natural death. That is not an easy thing to say in this society, and people will fight with you all the time about it. And maybe it isn't proclaimed as much sometimes because it is a cross and it's just too doggone hard to take up. I'm not going to say that. I'll just get in a fight with somebody. However, it's a social, protecting the sanctity of life is a social cross. Now this one is a little bit strike home these days. Taking up the cross is about defending the rights and the dignity of those who are mistreated, those who are misjudged, those who are discriminated against or marginalized, especially when such defense might elicit the criticism or even the disdain for others. So this is absolutely what our church is trying to do in the face of the disrespect that has happened with immigrants in this country. And the minute I say that, and probably somebody in the room is thinking it, oh, he's getting political now. He's getting political now. No, I'm not getting political. I'm being what I have been for almost 74 years, and that's a Catholic. That's what I'm being right now. But unfortunately, what has happened is that things have been politicized so much that if you start preaching gospel values, sometimes people stop listening because, oh, now you're just one of those. And that's not what it is. And it's a cross to take up, to defend the dignity of the human person, and to speak up about when somebody is mistreated or misjudged or all the rest of it. And it's not an easy thing. And it's also something that, in our own time, not to get off on this too much, but I'm afraid that it's happened that the first thing in so many people's heads these days is politics, when the first thing is supposed to be for us Catholics the gospel. And the politics part is a later thing. It's a different thing altogether. So, and sometimes the values that we teach as a church suffer because of the politicization of things that is not helpful. And I put this all in the context, as you can see why I call these social crosses, because it's not easy. And whoever said a cross was. However, maybe it is a little bit more meaningful if you and I understand it as a social cross. I guess that's what I'm getting at. Now here's one that's more fun. Well, I mean, it's not fun, but anyway, taking up the cross is about the cross of generously sharing what we have. Generosity is a cross. Generously sharing what we have is a cross. Because in the Catholic Church, we don't mean just sharing the leftover. We mean sharing from our substance, sharing from what we have. That's why the widow in the gospel who gave the 2 cents, which was everything that she had, was the one who was truly generous. And the guy who just gave the extra of the riches that he had, it was generous to a degree, but that's not what we mean by generous sharing. Not leftovers, the substance. And that's a cross. So, and here's the cool thing though. If we shared, just as Catholics, generously shared a portion of what we have, okay? A portion of our financial resources and a portion of our food if we shared just a portion of that, everybody did, just because it's the right thing to do. We don't just give food at Thanksgiving or have the meals and those are good things to do. But our fabric of life is to generously share a portion of what I have. That would go a long way toward alleviating hunger and poverty in the world, if you think about it. Because it would mean that there is a more equitable distribution of what our resources are. So generosity really has to do with justice. And whenever we're trying to live a just life, we're carrying a cross. It's not easy to do. So I call generous sharing I call it the cross of generously sharing what we have. And of course we do that, and I'm a big stewardship person, in the sense of the stewardship way of life, which is based on the fact that everything we are and everything that we have belongs to God. It's all a gift. So that's the posture that we live from, a posture of gratitude. Here's another one. This is really super Catholic, okay? No, okay. Taking up the cross is about measuring everything that we do by what we are first doing for those who have the least. As our church says, we are to have a preferential option for the poor. That's how the church puts it, okay? And it means that, and I remember I did this when I was a pastor, and when we were making decisions on the parish council or as a staff or whatever, the question I always raised, and the people then became used to it, okay, we need to repave the parking lot. And okay, now let's put in the mix of how does repaving the parking lot, how does that measure up against what we're doing to serve those who have the least? So you put your decisions, every decision has that as part of it, okay? It's a whole expanded way of thinking. But it's a necessary way of thinking if we're really going to have that, what the church says is the preferential option of the poor. And if you think about it, we won't do it now, but there's a lot of ways that we could think about repaving the parking lot and the resources that we're putting toward that. And as we agree to do that, how about as part of the paving project, we put X, Y, and Z, whatever it might be, to have a place for people to gather. I don't know what, but that's what I mean by measuring what we do against those who have the least. It's a cross. That's all I'm saying, okay? Taking up the cross is about honestly admitting our prejudice toward persons or groups. That's a hard one. And it's a cross, to acknowledge, do I have a bias or a prejudice against a group because of their, or a culture, because of the belief, or they're different, or whatever it is. And it's a cross to ask that question honestly. Taking up the cross is about opening our hearts to a new acceptance of people. Opening our hearts, and especially maybe to somebody that we've written off as being a lunatic or something like that. Watch it, who we write off. The person might at some point have something to say. That doesn't mean everybody always has something, worthwhile to say, but sometimes we write people off. Or maybe to have a new acceptance of ideas. Maybe even today, because of some of the stuff I'm sharing, there might be a kind of a nudge to accept something new or different, or to see something in a new way. So being here for you is a cross. I'm so sorry. No. But it's Lent. I mean, come on, all right? I couldn't have given this talk in Advent, so, okay. Taking up the cross is also about giving up old ways of doing things that we know we should give up. But it's just easier to keep doing things the same way we have always done them. I have had that one before. And I think the sign that it's time to take up the cross of thinking about it, letting go of an old way, is if you find yourself, well, I've always done it this way. Well, we've always done it this way. I remember I said at some point a while back, I said it in front of God and all the people that were seated in Christ Cathedral. I said, if you ever find yourself saying, well, it's just how I am, that's it.
Oh, yeah.
End of story. Okay?
Yeah.
Well, I suggest revising it. Well, that's just how I am. And maybe just how I am has to be revisited. And I have to take another look. If we are saying stuff, it's just how I am, end of story, this is how I've always done it, maybe it's a time to take up that cross of looking into maybe a different way or a new way. Here's one. Taking up the cross is about knowing when it's time to move on. Some of us stay in things too long. And I mean, when it's time to move on sometimes, in a friendship, that's a hard one, but that's, or when it's time to move on in an attitude, or it's time to move on in a job. I remember a couple years ago when I was thinking about retiring to be as rector of Christ Cathedral. That was hard for me because I didn't have to retire. The bishop, there's no age limit on priests retiring or age. You have to retire. We got off the hook more than bishops do. Bishops have to send in their resignation letter when they're 75. But at least in this diocese, we don't have that, okay? We can, we get our full benefit, our full paid, what do they call it, defined pension benefit when we turn 70, okay? So that's why a lot of diocesan priests retire at 70, okay? But it's not a mandatory thing. And I was turning 70, and I'd been thinking about it a couple years, but it was hard to move on. I was the first rector of Christ Cathedral. I helped get that thing off the ground, And I knew that things would be done differently. They always are if you move on in a different position. Priests have this, our deacon here, you have a whole life ahead of you of moving on. So I'm glad you're here. No. But it's a cross, And I remember And I talked about it with my spiritual director and my family and everything about my retiring and all the rest of it. But then I remembered my own words. This is the social cross of moving on. So it's time to do it, you know. And even after I made the decision, and I did it, and all of a sudden, you know, I'm not on the bulletin anymore. Fine. Well, that wasn't. No, but really, okay. So I had, you know what buyer's remorse is? You buy something and then you get it home and you say, why did I do this? So I had a little buyer's remorse, you know, for the first few months.
Amazon, you can send it back.
Yeah, I know, but this wasn't Amazon. So, yeah, hey, Bish, can I have my letter back, you know? So anyway, but let me just, I'm diverting just a moment here, but especially if you are retired or thinking about it or whatever, I got a phrase about a few years ago that I really like, and it really has helped me a lot, especially in terms of this transition, or even the transition of aging in that, okay? Which I haven't started yet, but anyway, so the thing I read is that when you retire, or a stage of aging is when you move from role to soul. Role, R-O-L-E, to soul, S-O-U-L. When you are in a role, like I was in the role of rector of Christ Cathedral, most of the way I lived my life was determined by what the requirements of the role were. Most of my days were spent that way. Most of the meaning that I found was based on the requirements of the role. So what happens when you don't have the role anymore? Does it mean you don't have anything anymore? Well, sometimes it can feel like that. However, the good news, which is why I love this, is because the definition of finding meaning is not placed there by external requirements. It's placed there by listening to the inner movement of the soul. And more, what is God calling me to? What is God asking me to do? Which sometimes, that's always part of the equation, but it gets to come out more when the forefront thing isn't the role requirements anymore. So I've just found that as a helpful little thing, moving from role to soul. Forever, however that might make a difference. Here's another social cross. Taking up the cross is about admitting that we were wrong. Hate that. And the other person was right. Okay? So the example is taking up the social cross of admitting that I'm wrong means I'm going to make the first phone call after a fight. Or I'm going to send the first text after some kind of disagreement. I'm going to be the first one to say I'm sorry, even though in my heart I didn't do it. And he should call me or text me, and I'm not doing anything till I hear from him or whatever. There's a cross involved in being the first one to make the first move. And so if you find it hard, it might be easier when you look at it as a cross, and there's a nobility of taking up the cross, because crosses, again, in the name of Jesus, are redemptive. Something good and new comes out of taking up the cross, which reminds me of another image that I'm going to go back to the moving on thing, which I love in the scripture when Jesus, he says, he talks about sending them out 2 by 2, and then they go to the houses, and then he goes in the town, and if he says, if they won't listen to you, does he say, stay there till they do? Nope. Move on and shake the dust off your feet. I love that. So maybe there's some dust shaking that needs to happen somewhere. I don't know, but move on. Taking up the cross means listening to the challenging words of Pope Francis, I love this. He says, the culture of well-being that we live in, and we do live in a culture of well-being, especially here, makes us think only of ourselves. And that can really be what happens. We think only of ourselves. And it can make us insensitive to the cries of others. So I had a good friend, gone to the Lord now, who used to have this, who said this line. And the line was, is the duty or the responsibility of privilege is absolute integrity. The responsibility or the duty of privilege is absolute integrity. So if we are privileged, which we are here in the United States, we have a responsibility to be people of integrity. And when people of privilege don't live with integrity, it's a mess. And that could explain things, some things that happen. Because privilege without integrity usually ends up in greed, selfishness, hurt, all that kind of stuff. So, Francis goes on to say that the culture of well-being that we live in makes us live in soap bubbles. Soap bubbles that are beautiful, but are nothing. And we can live like that. It's beautiful, but it's nothing because there's no substance. That kind of thing. So taking up the cross, the social cross, again, means acknowledging the soap bubbles that we may be living in order to avoid seeing the pain of others. And that can happen. Taking up the cross means looking at how we might have become insensitive, how we might have become so accustomed to hearing about the suffering of others that it doesn't concern us anymore, that it is none of our business, that we become numb. And we need to take up that cross of seeing where we may have become numb. I remember that when Hurricane Katrina, the one in New Orleans, that horrible hurricane, and then I remember a newscaster once saying that it is certainly true to say that in this country we are suffering from compassion fatigue. Compassion fatigue. Ooh. Those are not two good words together, compassion fatigue, because it means we've gotten so tired of being compassionate that we're fatigued by it. But it can happen, and that's why the cross of indifference is one that we have to, the cross of looking at how we might have become indifferent or numb is something that's worth doing from time to time. Taking up the cross means asking the Lord, as Pope Francis puts it, for the grace to weep over our indifference. For the grace to weep over the cruelty of the world, even the cruelty that may be in ourselves. And that's a tough one. The list could go on and on. And finally, in the gospel, when Jesus told the disciples to take up the cross, that they must take up the cross, he didn't say that on the wild chance that somehow they will succeed. I'm not really sure if it's going to work if they take up this cross, but I'm going to tell them to do it anyway. No. He said it because he knew that taking up our crosses, both the personal crosses and the social crosses, always points to the victory of the resurrection. Okay? And now remember, that gets back to the point when he first said it to them, they hadn't experienced him as resurrected, so it had to have been really hard to hear. He didn't have a wild dream that he was putting a chance on. No, he knew that the resurrection was going to happen. So taking up crosses always points to the victory of the resurrection. There's always redemption. And what does it mean? It means that taking up the cross will always result in something life-giving and new. And that's the motivation for taking it up in the first place, because it doesn't end here. It points to something life-giving and new. For most of us, there's no shortage of personal crosses. I don't imagine there's a whole lot of people sitting here, I really wish I had some more personal crosses. That'd be kind of cool, I don't think there's any shortage of those. I digress again. But sometimes I hear people talk about another person as their cross, and that always makes me so sad. But of course they would never say that to the person. You're my cross. But I think we've got to, just take care about calling people our crosses. Anyway, they might be challenging and all the rest of it, but anyway, there's no shortage of personal crosses. The picture about taking up the cross, I think, is complete when we add the social crosses of our actions to promote the well-being of others. That's what the summary of the social cross. What I do to promote the well-being of somebody else. So here's the progression. When I started again, Jesus carries the cross, Simon carries the cross, we carry our personal and social crosses. And I'm going to say it again, and then I'm going to put a little stamp at the end. Jesus carries the cross, Simon carries the cross, we carry our personal and social crosses. Now there is a formula for victory. So that's what I have to say about crosses. Okay? Anybody have any questions or comments or yes?
I'll just say something.
Yes.
So for the longest time, I thought my husband was my cross. We've been married almost 39 years, and then I realized that it was me. I was my own cross.
That's really personal.
It is.
I'm glad that you said it because that was the example I was going to use. Not you. But I was going to use that example of people in marriages coming to me and saying that their spouse is their cross. And I thought, that must be fun. And usually you're exactly right. It starts with us. So here's your carrying the cross notes. If you want, she gets, you get the first one because, no, just kidding. I'm sorry. She'll never come back. Yes.
I always think about carrying the cross when I was in Israel and Jerusalem, and we carried the cross, but it took 8 of us to carry that huge cross.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And I think about that so often.
Yeah, exactly. So here's the reflection questions just to take with you, to think about more. What do I think about the thought that there are personal and social crosses? And based on the examples of social crosses that I presented, what is a particularly difficult social cross for me to carry? That might be a good reflection for you during these days of Lent. So, before I move on to our last one, little briefer, anybody have a comment or a question or?
I have a deep theological question.
Yes.
What's with the Catholic preoccupation with repaving parking lots?
It's been a mystery my entire priesthood.
Think of all the benefits that the families, that work at these parking lot companies. I mean, you're giving to the poor, basically, through paving the parking lot.
Well, I don't know the exact answer to it. I'd like to think that it's because of the well-being of the people and being able to. It probably has to do with insurance.
No, it's funny because I was on the parish council
Yeah.
at least for years, and we repaved the parking lot. It didn't look like it needed it to be.
Yeah.
We did it.
You're right.
Over that parking lot out there at Parish Cathedral when it was like a roller coaster.
Oh, yeah.
You probably know that.
I don't know what you're talking about.
I actually prayed that you would repave that parking lot.
Yeah, well, you know that it's still like that.
Is it still like that?
Yeah, you know why?
Well,
It's because I presume you're talking about the part that's on Lewis Street, because that used to be set up like a drive-in theater. And the old drive-in theaters, they had those little mounds. Yeah, and they've talked about redoing it, but it's really expensive because the whole area would have to be regraded and stuff. But no, I just never got to that one. So, okay, are you ready for one last?
Sure.
Okay, so this is Life Wins. That's what I'm calling this one. And I want to start out by saying that in my ministry as a priest over almost 48 years, I have found that some of the most gentle and tender moments in people's lives happen around the death of a loved one. There's something about death in its own way that kind of brings out the tenderness of people. I have celebrated countless funeral masses, memorial services I've led graveside services. I have seen over and over again the tender care with which people treat each other at times of death. And in its own kind of odd way, the harsh and cold reality of death puts all of us in touch with our frailty and fragility as human beings. You can't, unless you're almost dead yourself, you can't be confronted with the temporariness of human life like you can be when somebody dies. The old Pharisee in the reading today at Mass that thanked God because he wasn't like the rest of humanity. Well, guess what he was? He forgot. He's going to die too. I mean, that's what it is. The cold reality of death puts us in touch with our frailty as human beings. And someone once wrote this in describing his best friend, and I love this. He said, "My friend was a person who died a little whenever someone or something precious died. My friend was gentle with life and with death. Died a little whenever someone or something precious died." Luke's gospel, we'll hear it many times, or not Luke's, but we'll hear Luke's at least once during Holy Week. "Father, into your hands I commend my spirit." And then the gospel says, when he had said this, he breathed his last. Those were his last words. The last words of someone precious who had died. And that precious someone was Jesus. Jesus Christ, God's beloved Son. Crucified, hanging dead on a cross. God's beloved Son, who taught about things like integrity and dignity and forgiveness and mercy and compassion and generosity and hope and justice and peace. Jesus, who taught us that when these things flourish, we all flourish. And also, when these things die, like integrity, dignity, forgiveness, mercy, and all the rest, when these things die, we all die a little. We all die a little. And so I say this, I hope it will be consoling, but it's no wonder that some of us might be feeling a little or maybe very anxious or unsettled or sad these days. It's no wonder that we might be feeling that way sometimes, because these days of war, these days of division, these days of unrest, these days of whatever hurt or grief or upset we have experienced in our personal lives means that a lot of goodness has also died. That's what happens in the midst of these kinds of things. And the story of Jesus, as we know, did not end with his dead body on that cross of crucifixion. The story continues because what looked like that defeat of death was, after all, not. As we know, Jesus broke through the power of sin. He broke through the power of physical death through his resurrection. And what does the resurrection proclaim? It proclaims that the power of God's love is stronger than the power of physical death and the death of sin. And another way of putting it is to say, Jesus' resurrection proclaims that life wins! Exclamation point. Life wins. I remember that whole little two-word thing came to me when I had another brother is conducting and preaching at our own relatives' funerals. It's hard. I remember at Matt, his name was Matt, at Matt's funeral, I was talking about the resurrection and stuff, and I just said, so I hope that we can carry within us, all of us, in Matt's memory, that life wins. Life wins. And then, whenever we say something kind to each other, life wins. Whenever we say, I forgive you, life wins. Life wins. And so what happened with that is that my brother, I have one brother left, and me, and three sisters, and then I have nieces and nephews that also loved Matt and their uncle, and were at the funeral. And over time, when something hard happens in my family, or there's this difficult circumstance, we text out to each other, life wins. And every so often I get a text from my niece, life wins, Uncle Chris. And they don't just text me that, they text each other that. And these are, some of them are teenagers, some of them are young adults, some are middle-aged. But just that they have within them that whole sense, when something is difficult, life wins, is powerful. And I have the blessing of that in my family. Jesus' victory over sin and death teaches us that real victory has nothing in the world to do with power over others. Real victory has nothing to do with being the most important person or having the most things. Real victory has to do with the capacity to find our best selves in the midst of good and evil. And that's what us Catholics have to do these days. We have to find our best selves. Don't let our worst selves come out, because we do have our worst selves too, okay? But we got best selves, we got great selves. And the way I put it, if we don't do it, who's going to do it? Okay? Our best selves need to come out at this time. At these times, all the time, but especially now, because that's the victory of the cross. Life wins. Our best selves need to come out. It is, and I say it's the recovery of our best selves that redeems the consequences of our worst actions and the actions of others. So if I've done something not so great, if I can recover my best selves after that by asking for God's forgiveness or whatever it is, that redeems the thing that wasn't good that took place. The resurrection of Jesus means that what is precious, maybe that has died in us, can live again. That's what resurrection is all about. The resurrection means that humanity, God's beloved, all of us, which dies a little when goodness dies, we can live again as goodness is restored. And that's what Lent leading up to Easter is all about. It's about goodness restored. And however that makes sense to you. Jesus' resurrection is an invitation to revive our capacity to live with integrity. to revive our capacity to respect the dignity of the human person, to revive our best selves, some of it that might have gone dormant a little bit or whatever it might be. It's possible for us, if we need to rekindle our ability to be people of forgiveness, to be people of mercy and compassion and generosity and hope. It's possible for us to fashion that world of justice and peace. Lots of times we don't think about those words, and they're worth thinking about every once in a while, to make sure that they're still alive within us. That I have this sense of being merciful and compassionate and generous and all the rest of it. So I say that the crucifixion of Jesus invites us to ask, and this is the question I invite you to ask during these next days of Lent. What is the goodness that may have died in each one of us since last Easter? What is the goodness that has died within you since last Easter? Just to think about that. And don't think about it in order to beat yourself up. Don't think about it to get depressed. No. It's not an easy question. And in asking it, as with life and death, we need to be gentle with ourselves in asking the question, what goodness has died in me since last Easter? Might be a great thing to take into Holy Week, you know? What is it? The resurrection of Jesus invites us to remember that as goodness is restored and all of humanity, all of God's beloved are made new. So again, like that man's best friend, we die a little when someone or something precious dies. So if we feel a little bit out of sorts sometimes or whatever, it's pretty normal that would happen, okay? And at the same time, what I pray for you and me is to say, may the goodness revived in each one of us, whatever that is, however you name it, let this be the gift of this Lenten season that we carry into the splendor of Easter. So if during these weeks you are able, and I am able, to name a goodness that has died in me so that it can be restored, we together can carry that revived goodness and have a glorious, glorious Easter. So that is my information, my invitation. In all of it, I say, in these tender times, and they are tender times, may we be gentle with ourselves, and may we be gentle with each other. And what I'd like to do as my final words, and it's harder now because of my allergy thing, but I'm going to do it anyway. I want to sing a spiritual that kind of captures the wonder of the Lord's redeeming love. It's called Wondrous Love. And it goes like this. What wondrous love is this, O my soul, O my soul? What wondrous love is this, O my soul? What wondrous love is this that caused the Lord of bliss to bear the dreadful curse for my soul, for my soul. To bear the dreadful curse for my soul. To God and to the Lamb I will sing, I will sing. To God and to the Lamb I will sing. To God and to the Lamb, who is the great I Am. While millions join the theme I will sing, I will sing. While millions join the theme, I will sing. And when from death I'm free, I'll sing on, I'll sing on. And when from death I'm free, I'll sing on. And when from death I am free, I'll sing and joyful be. And through eternity, I'll sing on, I'll sing on. And through eternity, I'll sing on. Today, how wonderful to declare with you, life wins. And I pray for you and for me a blessed Lent and a glorious Easter to all. So now we have another handout for you. This is the Life Wins handout. And what I also